If you've ever played any amount of competitive Yu-Gi-Oh, then you no doubt have encountered Floodgate cards. Love them or hate them, they've been a key part of the Yu-Gi-Oh metagame for almost as long as they've existed. From Vandy's Emptiness to Dimensional Barrier, these cards are designed to have some kind of negative effect on both players, preventing them from performing certain actions in game. But in practice, these floodgates are usually much more one-sided, since one player won't be affected nearly as much, or one player will have already been able to play the game before using it. So that got me thinking, should we just outright ban all these floodgate cards, or are they a necessary evil in the game? In today's video, I'll be talking about what I feel players may argue are the pros and cons of having floodgates in the game in as unbiased of a manner as possible. So without any further ado, let's get into it. Alright, so before we get into the discussion, I wanted to quickly go over the different types of floodgates. Now, this may not seem super important, but I think that there actually is a significant difference between the different types of floodgates that we have in the game right now, and that contributes to whether or not they should still be in the game, in my opinion. So starting off with maybe the most classic version of a floodgate, literally a continuous trap that stays up on the board that has some sort of negative effect. So maybe a common example of this is Vandy's Emptiness. And then the next type are the lingering types. Like once you play it, it goes to the graveyard, but its effect lingers for a turn or two. So something things like Different Dimension Ground or Mistaken Arrest. And then the third type are actually the floodgates that you can play turn 1, like without having to wait a turn. So all the floodgates before that we mentioned, you're going to have to set them and then activate them on your opponent's turn. But something like Dimensional Fissure, you can activate right away. And why that's significant is because its effect can start applying right away. And then finally, the last type of floodgate is going to be the searchable kind. So maybe the most prevalent example in the metagame is Spell Canceller. So just keep that in mind when we go through this discussion. There are different types of floodgates, and they're not exactly all the same as each other. So do just keep that in mind as we go through this discussion. So I'm going to do this by talking about arguments for both sides. Starting off with the argument that we shouldn't ban all floodgates. I think the most obvious argument to this is that most floodgates at least have some counterplay to them. So for example, think about the normal floodgates that we talked about in the last section. Cards like Vandy's Emptiness, cards like Mistake or Shadow Imprisoning Mirror that you see here. These are cards that can be destroyed and removed from the field with cards that are generic enough to be played in every deck, like Harpy's Feather Duster. There is also a world where, for some of these floodgates at least, you can simply just play through it with good sequencing or good deck building choices. You don't necessarily always have to auto lose to a floodgate when it gets flipped. And so I think one of the biggest arguments for just not banning them outright is that they do kind of encourage some form of skill expression where you're not just like mindlessly playing cards. It kind of forces you to think about like, okay, if my opponent has this floodgate, is there a way I can sequence my plays better so that I'm able to actually play around it and beat it? Another argument is that floodgates can quote-unquote even the playing field for decks that are naturally weaker than other decks in the format, or lessen the skill difference between players. Just think about how many games have been won when a rogue deck just flips a floodgate that the meta deck can't deal with, or a player who's isn't necessarily as skilled as their opponent, just flipping up a floodgate and saying, okay, it doesn't matter if you're better than me. In some sense, that can be sort of a balancing mechanic that is necessary in a card game. It makes it so a wider variety of decks can potentially compete. Maybe they're not competing in terms of how strong their engines are, but it still gives them at least a chance to be played at the highest level and still have the potential to do well. Basically, the bottom line argument, I think, for the side of not banning all the floodgates is that you can see them as sort of necessary evils in order to check the best decks in the game. Like, if there were no floodgates that could hit the best decks, well, all those best decks would just be running rampant. And instead of losing to a floodgate, you'd probably just be losing to that deck setting up a big board or something that you can't break. Basically, they're there to slow the game down, make it a little bit more even for all decks. If you're finding this discussion interesting so far, then I just ask that you please check if you're subscribed to the channel. Only a very small percentage of my viewers are actually subbed, and by subscribing, you not only let YouTube know that you enjoy seeing this, which will help my channel grow, you also help keep me motivated to keep posting more of these videos in the future. It doesn't cost you anything, but it means the world to me, so thank you in advance. Now let's move to the other side of the coin on whether or not we should ban all floodgates. So these are the arguments that I think make sense in favor of banning all the floodgates that we have in the game. So I think the biggest and most obvious argument for banning all of them, like I mentioned at the very start of the video, floodgates were intentionally designed, at least in my opinion, to have an equally negative effect on both players. But in practice, most of the floodgates that are being played are just too one-sided. For example, I get to go first, set up my big board, and then flip my floodgate that says neither of us can, like, for example, add cards from deck to the hand. But it doesn't really matter if I've already gotten to play the game and add all the cards I need from deck to the hand, right? Because I'm going first. Or a floodgate just simply doesn't affect the other players. Think about how strong of a card Dimension Shifter is. My Dracotail opponent gets to go first. I'm playing Malice. I drop Dimension Shifter on them. They can't do anything, but it doesn't affect me at all. Ultimately, this can make it feel very imbalanced when one player does get to see this overpowered floodgate and then the other player just can't really do anything about it. I also think another big problem is that most of these floodgates are just way too easily accessible in the modern game nowadays. So maybe back in the day when there was like, let's say 1 copy of Vanity's Emptiness in everyone's deck, it wasn't a searchable card. Maybe you'll see it once every like 8 to 10 games, which is not that big of a deal. But nowadays, with cards like Triple Tactics Thrust, decks being able to draw so many more cards than they ever have been before, or just having decks that can search a Floodgate, like I mentioned with Spell Canceller, this can make it so these Floodgates are seen in more games than not. And ultimately, that can be a very frustrating experience for anyone to play against, because if they're dealing with these super broken cards almost every game that they play and they can't really do anything about it, it's not going to be a good time. Also, another argument to just ban all the Floodgates outright, even if that specific Floodgate isn't good at this current moment, it's possible it can be problematic in the future and become overpowered. There was a period of time, let's say between Zodiac format in 2017 and 1 or 2 years ago in Rizio format, where a card like Dimensional Barrier was decent, but it wasn't necessarily seeing play in every single deck. Or back when Dimension Shifter was released, it wasn't necessarily seeing play in every single deck to begin with, but over time as more and more decks entered the game, there were inevitably going to be decks that just didn't care about Dimension Shifters and downsides, and decks that were severely hampered by Dimension Shifter. So even though those cards weren't necessarily problems for certain periods of the metagame, ultimately, these are cards that undoubtedly became problematic later on in the future, as we see with a card like Dimensional Barrier or Shifter. So the bottom line for this side of the argument is that just having these Floodgates in the game generally leads to more uninteractive and unfun games for everyone, both for the player playing against the Floodgate and even for the player playing the Floodgate. If let's say I'm playing Malice, I drop Dimension Shifter, my opponent just passes turn. Well, I basically just played Solitaire and just won the game from there. That sort of experience can make it feel like games are decided more by luck or RNG as opposed to actual skill. So that kind of leads me to this next part of the discussion. Are there any middle ground solutions? Do we have to ban all the Floodgates, or do we have to keep all of them in the game for the game to remain fair? And here I've listed a few solutions that I think could potentially work. The first, maybe most obvious solution is just to give players more outs to Floodgates in the format. For example, we have 1 copy of Harpy's Feather Duster, 3 copies of Lightning Storm, a few other back row removal cards, but generally most of these cards aren't seeing play aside from Harpy's Feather Duster and maybe Lightning Storm from here or there. But if we were to introduce a card, let's say like Red Reboot back into the game, these like, let's say, lingering trap cards that would otherwise play around cards like Harpy's Feather Duster, well, they no longer are able to do that when Red Reboot is a thing. But I think the biggest problem that you can all probably see with this is that a card like Red Reboot is incredibly broken in its own right and is essentially a Floodgate for any trap deck that you're playing against. At least at the moment, I don't think there are enough cards to sort of counteract all the possible different Floodgate iterations that we have out there. Even if we get a card like Red Reboot back somehow, well, that doesn't deal with like the searchable Floodgates like Spell Canceller, or it doesn't deal with the spell Floodgates like Dimensional Fissure, for example. So I ultimately don't think there are enough cards, at least at the moment, that can be used to counteract all the possible Floodgate options that we have. So ultimately, maybe the solution wouldn't be the best. Another possible solution is just to simply straight up go ahead with banning all the Floodgates and then try to scale back the power level of the game so that Floodgates just aren't needed in the first place. At least at the time of recording, we're in the midst of Branded Dracotail format, and I think Branded Dracotail is a deck that almost perfectly encapsulates this. It's still a very powerful meta deck, but I don't think you need to Floodgate the deck in order to beat it. If deck's power levels were able to get to sort of the same level as Dracotail is, I think that's something that could ultimately lead to Floodgates just not being needed in the first place. Now, ultimately, this is very hard to implement, and I'm sure inevitably there's going to be a deck that's going to be way stronger than they anticipated, so I don't think the solution is perfect either. Another potential fix is just to be able to fix some of the most problematic Floodgates that we have at the moment by errataing them. This one, I think, is a little bit more experimental, and there may not be a perfect way to errata every single Floodgate to make it more fair. Like, for example, if there was a line of text on maybe, let's say, a card like Mistake, you can't activate this card this turn if you added more than 2 cards from your deck to the hand during the previous turn. Ultimately, though, this is something that's just very experimental and probably not actually going to happen, but I thought at least it'd be interesting to talk about. Overall, it's also possible that there's no good middle ground solution to this problem. Curious, let me know what you think in the comment section below. Do you think there's a solid middle ground solution to this Floodgate issue, or do you think we either have to ban them all or keep them all? I'm curious to hear what you think. Before I end off the video, I just want to give a quick shout out to Card Trader. You can check them out using my affiliate link in the description below and use code TCGSAM for 5% off your entire order while helping to support the channel. Again, keep in mind that this is just meant to be an interesting, thought-provoking discussion. I'm not saying like one of these options is necessarily correct or better than the other, but I am curious to hear what you guys think, so do let me know in the comment section. But with all that being said, I just want to thank you guys so much for watching, and I will see you guys in the next one.